We've looked at a lot of CSS3 pseudo classes so far, but there are still a few more. Let's take a look at the last 5. The first pseudo class we'll be covering here is called first of type, and it's very similar to the nth of type pseudo class. In fact, it's functionally equivalent to saying nth of type 1. So let's switch over to our HTML. Just to remind you, in our markup, we have several divs with the class post, which you can see right here. Let's say that we wanted to highlight the first one. So we'll switch over to our CSS, and we'll go ahead and select our content div, and we'll select all of our posts, and then we'll say first of type, and we'll change the background to our familiar orange color. And when we switch back to the browser and refresh, there we have it. The first element of the type post has been selected. Similarly, we can use the last of type pseudo selector to select the last element. So let's try that out. So we'll say last of type instead of first of type. We'll save that. And when we switch back to the browser and refresh, if we scroll down, there it is. These two pseudo classes are similar to first child and last child. The difference is if you have other elements mixed in with your group and it's not a homogeneous selection as it is in our case, you'll want to specify what type of element you want your initial grouping to be composed of. Next up, we have the only child selector. To experiment with this, we'll actually have to modify our markup a little bit to create an artificial example. So I'll switch back to our markup here, and in our header div, I'm going to go ahead and delete this H2 here, and I'm going to create a new header side by side with our old one. And this is actually invalid markup because we have two IDs here, so let's change those to classes. And in our second header here, we're going to change this a little bit so that it says another, and we're going to create another H1, and we'll change that to header, just so we can tell the difference between each one of these headers here. So now let's switch over to our CSS, and let's go ahead and use the only child selector, and then I'll go ahead and explain it. So I'll just delete what we have here, and we'll select our new header class, and we'll select our H1s, and then we'll say only child, and we'll keep the background orange. And when we scroll up here and refresh the page, what exactly is going on? Well, in the markup, we have two divs with the class header, which you just saw. Inside of the first header div, there is only this single H1, which is the one that has been highlighted with the orange background. Inside of the second header div, there are two H1 tags, and they have not been highlighted, which you can see here. That's because the only child selector will only select groupings that have a single child element. So let's switch back to the CSS. Let's say that you have several unordered lists and you wanted to select only the lists that had a single list item in them. The only child selector would be perfect for that kind of thing because you could pick out the lists that only have one child. Similar to the type selectors and the only child selector, there is the only of type selector. So let's go ahead and try that out. So we'll keep what we have here, and we'll change child to say only of type, and we'll keep our orange background. When we switch back and refresh, unremarkably, this appears to have the same effect as the only child selector. But let's switch back to the code so that we can pick out the subtle difference here. Let's say that there were several more divs with the class header. They might also only have one child element, but they could be H1s, H2s, or any other element. By using only of type, like we are here, we're essentially applying two filters at once. The last CSS3 pseudo class that we have not yet covered is the empty pseudo class. For this one, we need to change the markup yet again to demonstrate it. So let's switch back to our markup, and in our second header here, we're just going to delete everything we have, and we're even going to make sure that we remove all of the space between our opening and closing tags. Now with that out of the way, we can switch back to our CSS. So I'm going to change this selector quite a bit here. I'm going to first select our header class, and then I'm going to change this to say empty. And we're going to use our orange background, but we also need to do a few other things here, which I'll explain in just a second. We'll give it a width and height of 200 pixels, and then we'll say display block. Now, as you've probably gathered by watching me code, the empty pseudo class will only select items that are completely empty. Because our header won't take up any space if it's empty, I have added some supplementary styles so that we can see it being selected. So when we switch back to our browser and refresh, there you have it. You can see our empty div is indeed being selected. That's it for pseudo classes in CSS3. In the next video, we'll take a look at a few more miscellaneous selectors that we haven't yet covered.